video still going? No, I guess it's not. So I was videotaping and my alarm just went off. So, but as I was saying, my book I'm finishing the final edits, and my editor wanted me to read it on video. I don't know if I'm going to share this video, but I'm going to read my part of my book, chapter 2, titled Invisible Wounds. It's a very intense chapter, and when I was reading through it just now, I started to cry. So I hope I got it out of my system. Here it goes. I don't remember the exact day the mask appeared. No child does. It does not arrive with ceremony. No one announces its creation. There's no mirror held up to your face while someone says, "This is the version of you that will survive." The mask forms quietly. A smile when you're hurting, a joke when you're lonely, a performance when you're afraid. I silence when speaking feels dangerous. By the time I was old enough to recognize it, I had already been wearing mine for years. As a child, I believed families operated on an invisible language everyone understood except me. There seemed to be rules hidden beneath every conversation, expectations woven into every interaction. I watched other people navigate them effortlessly while I stood at the edge, studying expressions, tones, and gestures as though I were learning a foreign dialect. I learned quickly that being intelligent did not guarantee belonging. Being helpful did not guarantee affection. Being obedient did not guarantee safety. Love, at least as I understood it then, seemed conditional upon becoming whatever version of myself other people needed, so I adapted. Children are evolutionary geniuses. When nourishment is scarce, they learn to survive on crumbs. When affection is inconsistent, they become experts in reading moods. When emotional connection disappears, they become performers. I became all three. The adults around me likely saw a bright child, a capable child, a resilient child. What they did not see was the constant calculation occurring beneath the surface. How should I act? What answer do they want? What expression belongs here? What version of me is safest today? Years later, after my autism diagnosis, I would discover there was a name for part of what I had been doing: masking. The exhausting practice of studying social behavior and reproducing it so convincingly that even you begin to forget where the performance ends and the self begins. But this chapter is not about diagnosis. Not yet. This is about origin, because every mask has a creation story. Mine began long before I understood why I needed one. If Denise is the human story, Sophia is the myth. Not the Sophia of religion, not the Sophia of doctrine, not the Sophia of doctrine. The Sophia who appeared years later when I began examining my own life as if it were a symbolic text. The Sophia who asks, what if your wounds were speaking a language? What if your survival mechanisms became characters? What if the child was building a mythology before she had words for it? In myth, The hero receives armor before entering the wilderness. In real life, children create armor because the wilderness has already arrived. My armor became likability, achievement, humor, helpfulness, hypervigilance, disguised as maturity. People praised these traits. No one recognized them as protective equipment. How could they? Neither did I. The world rewards masks that function well, especially in girls. Especially in children who learn that becoming easy to love is safer than asking why love feels difficult. Sophia tells me now that every mask contains a paradox. It protects, it conceals, it saves, it separates. The same structure that shields the wound also prevents anyone from seeing it. For years, I believed people misunderstood me. Now I wonder how many were simply seeing the mask I had spent decades perfecting. How could they know the difference? Some days even I could not. The mythology of my childhood is not dragons and castles. It is quieter than that. It is a little girl standing in a room full of people, feeling invisible while simultaneously being noticed for all the wrong reasons. It is becoming an observer because participation feels dangerous. It is learning that understanding other people is often easier than understanding yourself. It is carrying questions too large for a child. Why do I feel different? Why am I always watching? Why does belonging seem so effortless for everyone else? Why do I feel like I arrived without the instruction manual everyone else received? Those questions became the first threads in the tapestry of Sophia, the seeker, the witness, the keeper of hidden knowledge, the archetype waiting decades to emerge. At the time, however, there was no Sophia. There was only me, a child doing what children have always done, surviving. Building a mask sophisticated enough to navigate a world that rarely asks what was happening beneath it. The tragedy is not the mask existed. The tragedy is that it worked. It worked so well that people mistook adaptation for wellness, performance for confidence, compliance for connection, maturity for healing, and eventually so did I. That is how the story begins. And eventually, and that is how the story begins. Not with the diagnosis, not with the trauma, not with HIV/AIDS, not with awakening, not with forgiveness. It begins with a mask. And a little girl who did not yet know the difference between becoming who she was and becoming who she needed to be, human and myth. By the time I learned the word masking, I already spent decades doing it. The diagnosis would come later. The understanding would come later still. But the practice began in childhood, long before I possessed language for what was happening beneath the surface. At first, I thought everyone felt this way. I assumed everyone entered a room immediately began calculating. Who is safe? Who is angry? What version of myself belongs here? What answer will make them smile? What answers will make them stop looking at me? I believed this was simply what being human meant. Only years later did I realize I had been studying life the way an anthropologist studies a foreign culture. Observing, recording, adapting, performing, surviving. The adults around me often described me as mature, responsible, helpful, old for my age. What they could not see was that the maturity is sometimes just hypervigilance wearing a respectable outfit. When a child grows up in uncertainty, observation becomes a survival skill. You learn to read rooms before you enter them. You learn moods before words are spoken. And you learn that safety often depends on anticipating the emotional weather of everyone around you. So I watched and I learned. And slowly, without realizing it, I began constructing a version of myself designed for public consumption. The masks. The masks were never a lie. That is what makes it so complicated. A lie is simple. A mask is made from real pieces. The helpful girl was real. The funny girl was real. The high-achieving girl was real. The peacemaker was real. The caretaker was real. But they were fragments, not the whole. Pieces assembled into a character that could move safely through the world. A character who asked for very little. A character who caused very little trouble. A character who learned that acceptance often depended on usefulness. The mask was not deception, it was adaptation. And adaptation is one of the oldest survival instincts known to humanity. When I look back now, I see two stories unfolding simultaneously. The human story and the myth. The human story belongs to a little girl in Missouri trying to make sense of her family, her world, and her place within it. The myth belongs to Sophia, not a person, not a ghost, not a religious figure, an archetype. A voice, a lens through which meaning eventually emerged. Sophia appears much later in the timeline, but she exists here because she helps me understand what the child could not. The child believed she was broken. Sophia recognizes she was adapting. The child believed she was different. Sophia recognizes she was observing. The child believed she was invisible. Sophia recognizes she was becoming a witness. One experiences and the other interprets. Together they tell a story. Carl Jung believed that every person develops a persona, the face presented to the world. The persona is necessary. Without it, society would be impossible. But problems arise when the persona becomes mistaken for the self, when the mask becomes more familiar than the face beneath it. I did not know it then, but I was becoming extraordinarily skilled at being who other people needed me to be. Teachers saw one version. Families saw another. Friends saw another. Employers would eventually see another. Each role carried its own script, its own expectations, its own performance requirements, and because I was good at performing them, few people questioned the cost, including myself. Sophia asked a question I could not have answered as a child. Who are you when no one's watching? For years, I had no idea. Not because I lacked an identity, because I had spent so much energy adapting that I rarely had access to it. The mask had become automatic, reflective, invisible, like breathing. The very mechanism that protected me from rejection also separated me from myself. Looking back, I do not resent the masks. I owe them a great deal. It helped me survive childhood. It helped me navigate school. It helped me maintain jobs. It helped me move through a world that often felt confusing, unpredictable, and emotionally unsafe. The masks were never the enemy. The problem came when survival became a permanent identity, when adaptation became a way of life, when the character remained long after the danger had passed, because eventually every mask asked for payment, not in money, in authenticity, in exhaustion, in disconnection, in the quiet loneliness of being loved for a version of yourself that is only partially true. This is where my story truly begins. Not with the diagnosis, not with the revelation, not with healing, but with a child who became an actress without realizing she had entered the stage. A child who learned to read everyone except herself. A child who wore a mask so convincingly that even she forgot she was wearing it. And somewhere beneath that carefully crafted face, the real story waited. Patient, silent, and unseen. Waiting for Sophia to arrive and ask the question that would change everything. Who were you before you learned to perform? After high school, the ongoing emotional neglect, family silence, feeling unseen pushed me into working 3 jobs and enrolled in a local community college full-time. I worked at daycare as a classroom teacher for 3-year-olds from open to close. And at night, I worked at a comedy club as a receptionist and ticket taker. And on the weekends, when I wasn't at the comedy club, I was working with my boyfriend who owned his own grass cutting business. Also babysat for families whom I knew through the daycare. I made it through my gen eds in college with a minimum C average. And after 3 semesters, my high school boyfriend and I transferred to a university. And that's where I'm going to end right now. Throughout the rest of that chapter, I talk about my personal life and the masks that I wore. And that's my whole book. I discuss how I found out who I really was and the identity underneath all those masks and those parts that I played and the reason for those parts. And in my healing journey, I realize who I really am. Thank you for watching.